Welcome to The Last Hike. Today we'll talk about how El Capitan met a woman with zero skill and infinite ego, and it went exactly how you'd expect.
She took every warning as a personal attack and every offer to help as a declaration of war. And when she fell, she didn't just drop off the wall, she dropped every illusion that fake confidence could outclimb reality. It was September 14th, 2015. Renata Colville was in her late 30s when this happened, and she had been climbing for several years by that point. Not decades, years. Enough time to feel genuinely confident, to have a mental list of things she had accomplished, to have developed a personality around the sport. And that right there is where things start to get complicated. Because competence and confidence are not the same thing, and Renata had a lot more of the second one than the first.
Before we get into Renata specifically, I want to paint the picture of where all of this happened because the setting matters enormously here.
We are talking about a massive granite wall in the western United States, one of the most famous climbing destinations in the world, the kind of place that draws people from every country, that shows up in documentaries, that experienced climbers dream about for years before they ever set foot on it. It is enormous in a way that is genuinely hard to describe if you have never stood at the base of it. 3,000 feet of raw stone rising straight up out of the valley floor, catching the morning light in this golden, almost absurd way that makes it look like something out of a painting. Late summer in the western mountains is a tricky time. The days are still long and warm, which makes the climbing comfortable in the early hours, but afternoon thunderstorms can roll in fast, and the temperature swings between sunrise and midday can be significant. The year this happened, sometime around 2017 or 2018, the forecast for the specific days in question was considered favorable. Clear skies, moderate temperatures, low wind, good conditions by any measure. That kind of forecast tends to bring out a lot of climbers, and this particular summer was no exception. The base of the wall and the surrounding trailheads were buzzing with activity in the days leading up to the accident. The route Renata and her partner had chosen was what climbers call a grade 5 traditional route. That label carries a lot of weight. It means the climb is long enough and serious enough that most parties are expected to sleep on the wall, to haul gear, hang in a tent rigged to the rock face, and continue the next morning. It is not a route for people who are still figuring out the basics. It demands commitment, physical endurance, sound judgment, and a lot of gear. Most experienced parties spend at least one full night on the wall, sometimes two, depending on their pace and the conditions. This is not a day hike with ropes. This is an expedition.
I have to be honest with you, I found Renata difficult to like, even as a subject.
And I think that discomfort is worth sitting with, because she was still a human being, and what happened to her was still a tragedy. But I also think sanitizing who she was would be a disservice to the actual lesson of this story.
I'm gonna tell you who she was as accurately as I can piece it together from the accounts of people who knew her, encountered her, or were present that day.
Renata was, by most accounts, the kind of person who turned every interaction into an opportunity to establish that she knew more than you. She had a background in outdoor recreation and had completed a handful of multi-pitch climbs routes that require multiple rope lengths and some level of technical skill. She was not a beginner, but she was nowhere close to being an expert on something like a major grade 5 wall. The gap between those two things is vast, and it mattered a lot. What made it worse was that Renata genuinely did not seem to believe the gap existed. In online climbing communities, she was known for leaving long, winding comments arguing that regulations were excessive, that fees were a form of exploitation, and that the dangers of climbing were routinely exaggerated by authorities who either did not understand the sport or had some other agenda. She was particularly vocal about what she called government overreach on public land. She had opinions about everything and delivered them at volume. Her climbing partner on this trip was a man named Doven Marsh. Doven was quieter, less experienced, and this detail matters deeply conflict averse. He had climbed with Renata before and had noticed her patterns. He knew that pushing back on her tended to create more problems than it solved, so he had developed a strategy of gentle agreement and quiet accommodation, filling in wherever she left gaps, smoothing things over with strangers she had offended, finishing tasks she started and abandoned. It was not a healthy dynamic, and it was going to have real consequences before the day was over. They arrived at the wilderness trailhead before the sun came up, which was actually the right call. Most serious parties start early to maximize daylight on the wall. The parking area area was already partially full. A few headlamps bobbed around in the dark as other climbers organized their gear. There was a self-registration permit station near the trailhead, a simple kiosk where you fill out a form, tear off your copy, and go. It takes maybe 5 minutes. Most people treat it as an ordinary part of the process. Renata did not treat it as an ordinary part of the process. Before she had even finished reading the first field on the form, she was already talking loudly. The permit requirement, in her view, was a symptom of everything wrong with how public land was managed. She announced to no one in particular that nobody should need paperwork just to go for a climb, that the whole system existed so agencies could collect data and eventually justify charging people for more things, that it was an infringement on the basic right to access land that belonged to all Americans. Several other climbers nearby shifted uncomfortably. A few exchanged looks.
Nobody said anything, because what do you say to that at 5 in the morning?
She moved through the forum the way someone moves through a traffic jam aggressively, with commentary about every obstacle. The emergency contact field particularly annoyed her. She questioned aloud why anyone needed to know who to call if something went wrong.
Struck me when I first read about it as both darkly ironic and genuinely alarming.
Doven quietly finished most of the forum while she monologued. When they finally moved away from the kiosk, a few of the other climbers let out quiet exhales.
I'm not exaggerating when I say that this kind of behavior is a warning sign. Not a moral warning sign, I mean like a practical one.
Someone who cannot move through a 5-minute bureaucratic process without turning it into a political argument is someone whose attention is already fragmented before the climb even begins. The hike to the base of the wall takes a while, and Renata used the time productively if your goal is to stay furious. She worked through a mental list of grievances as they walked. Trail maintenance signs that she found condescending, restrictions on fixed protection that she interpreted as anti-climber sentiment, a posted informational board about recent search and rescue operations in the area that, for reasons I still do not fully understand, made her angry rather than thoughtful. About halfway to the wall, they passed a volunteer steward, one of those people who donate their time to stand near popular trailheads and remind visitors about seasonal closures, wildlife nesting areas, leave no trace practices, that sort of thing. This particular volunteer, a polite young woman, mentioned that a section near the base had a seasonal closure for nesting raptors and gave them a brief description of where the boundaries were. It was the kind of information most climbers nod at and file away. Renata stopped walking. What followed was a brief but excruciating exchange in which Renata informed the volunteer that she was familiar with the rules, that she had been climbing in this area for years.
And this is the part that genuinely gets under my skin, that she had probably been climbing longer than the volunteer had even been alive.
The volunteer was a young woman, maybe mid-20s, and she handled the whole thing with impressive patience. She smiled, said she understood, and wished them a good climb. Renata walked away, still muttering. Doven said nothing. There is something particularly telling about that interaction. The volunteer was not accusing Renata of anything. She was giving the same information to every climber who passed. Renata's response tells you something important. She was not actually reacting to what was being said. She was reacting to the feeling of being addressed at all, of being included in a general reminder, as though that implied she did not already know. Her ego was the trigger, and once it was triggered, it did not easily reset. By the time they reached the base of the wall, the light had shifted from gray to gold, and other climbers were already there, sorting through enormous haul bags, organizing protection, double-checking systems. There is a particular kind of focused, quiet energy at the base of a serious climb, and most of the people there were deep in it, methodical, unhurried, thorough. Renata and Doven's setup looked different. Their rack, the collection of gear they would use to protect themselves on the wall, was noticeably smaller than what the other parties had. Their supplies were lean. There was no emergency bivouac equipment visible, no extra layers for the cold that comes at altitude after the sun drops, minimal emergency provisions of any kind. This caught the eye of a climbing ranger who was doing routine patrol in the area. His name is Officer Breslin. He was doing his job that day, and what happened between him and Renata is one of the most important parts of this story. Breslin was experienced. He had seen a lot of parties at the base of this wall, and he had a well-developed sense of what a prepared party looked like versus what a party that was going to need help looked like. Renata and Doven fell pretty clearly into the second category. He approached them the way rangers are trained to approach climbers, not accusatorially, not dramatically, but conversationally. He asked what route they were planning, whether they intended to push through in a single day, or planned to bivouac on the wall, and what their planned turnaround time was. These are standard questions. They are designed to open a dialogue, not to catch anyone out. Then he explained what he had observed over the years on this particular route. It was longer and more demanding than many people expected going in. Several parties in recent years had needed assistance, some due to equipment issues, some due to exhaustion, some due to weather that moved in faster than the forecast had suggested. Afternoon conditions at elevation could change in ways that were hard to predict. Retreat became genuinely difficult after certain pitches because of the nature of the terrain. He recommended they carry more water. He recommended an emergency shelter. He suggested a more conservative approach to timing. He was measured, specific, and professional. And then Renata started talking.
I want to be clear that I understand the experience of feeling like an authority figure is underestimating you.
I think most of us have been in a situation where someone in a position of power spoke to us as though we were less capable than we actually are, and it feels bad. It can make you defensive in a way that is genuinely hard to control. I understand that impulse. But that is not what was happening here. Breslin was looking at a rack that was objectively under-equipped for what they were planning. He was delivering information that was factually accurate. And even if Renata had disagreed with his assessment, there were about 40 different ways she could have handled it that did not involve what she actually did. She interrupted him before he had finished his recommendations. She accused him of profiling climbers, of looking at them and making assumptions about their competence without any basis. She told him that warnings like this were unnecessary, that public employees always assumed climbers were incompetent, that the whole encounter was a form of intimidation designed to scare people away from the routes they had every right to climb. Her voice got louder. The climbers nearby stopped pretending not to listen. Some of them watched openly. Breslin remained calm. He said, clearly and without escalating, that he was only providing safety information and that they were free to make their own choices. This did not help. Renata raised her voice further. She used the word harassment. She said she knew her rights. She said she paid taxes for this land. She demanded to see his identification, asked for his supervisor's name, and requested information on how to file a formal complaint. The confrontation stretched on for several minutes, much longer than it needed to, much longer than Breslin wanted it to go, and much longer than any of the nearby climbers were comfortable watching. Eventually, Breslin disengaged. Before he walked away, he told them to climb safely. It was a small thing to say, and he said it quietly, but I think about it a lot. He walked away from that interaction knowing there was a real possibility he had just spoken to someone for the last time.
I don't know what that feels like, but I imagine it's pretty heavy.
A few climbers nearby made quiet comments to each other about how the ranger had just been doing his job. Nobody said it to Renata directly, and Renata, still vibrating with fury, began organizing her gear.
Here's the thing about anger that I find genuinely fascinating from a psychological standpoint. It doesn't just live in the moment.
It spreads. It bleeds into the next 30 minutes, the next hour. It fragments your attention in ways you are often not even aware of. Renata was angry in a way that had nowhere to go, and so it went everywhere. For the next half hour, she kept returning to the confrontation. She rehearsed what she was going to write in her complaint. She talked about reporting the ranger. She made a series of increasingly wide claims about how the climbing community was being strangled by regulation, about how public land management had become hostile to individual freedom, about how encounters like this one were a symptom of a much larger problem. Doven listened and offered small, non-committal sounds of agreement. He was not processing any of it. He was waiting for it to stop. Then another climber, a friendly, well-meaning guy who had been nearby during part of the ranger confrontation, made the mistake of suggesting that Renata might want to consider carrying more water because the temperature was expected to climb significantly through the morning. He said it gently. He said it the way you say something to a stranger that you think might genuinely help them. Renata told him she did not ask for advice, and that everyone suddenly seemed to think they were an expert. He walked away without responding.
I think he made the right call. You can't reason someone out of a state that they didn't reason themselves into.
What I want you to notice is how much energy Renata was burning on all of this. Emotional energy, cognitive energy, attention, all of it was going toward the ranger, toward the complaint she was drafting in her head, toward proving a point that no one around her actually needed her to prove. None of it was going toward what she was about to do, which was tie into a rope and step onto a 3,000-foot wall. There is a concept in psychology sometimes called attentional narrowing, where a strong emotional state causes your focus to collapse inward. You stop processing your environment accurately because your brain is too busy processing the emotional event. It happens to everyone. It happens to surgeons, to pilots, to athletes. The research on it is pretty clear. Strong negative emotions degrade performance on tasks that require careful attention, especially procedural tasks where you are working through a checklist or a sequence of steps. Climbing preparation is almost entirely procedural. You follow a sequence, you check things in a specific order. When that sequence gets disrupted by an emotion that has nowhere to go, errors creep in. Renata was not stupid. She was not careless in some fundamental character sense. She was a person in the grip of a strong emotional state, doing a task that required something she no longer had available to give. By the time they actually sat down to prepare their gear, Renata was behind the mental pace you need to be at before a serious climb. She was rushing through the process not dramatically, not visibly to someone who did not know her, but in ways that Doven noticed. Her usual methodical approach to sorting protection and checking equipment was abbreviated. Things ended up in the wrong pockets. Steps that she normally followed in a specific order got shuffled or skipped. She was thinking about the ranger. She was thinking about her complaint. She was thinking about everything except what was directly in front of her. Doven noticed. He noticed that she seemed distracted, that she kept circling back to the confrontation mid-task, that her normally careful rhythm was off. He suggested they take a short break before starting, just sit down, breathe, let the morning settle. It was a good suggestion. It was, in fact, exactly what they needed to do. Renata refused. She said they needed to get moving.
I'm not going to pretend I don't understand Doven's position here.
He was in a relationship, a climbing partnership, but with all the social weight that any long-term partnership carries with someone who was not in a place to receive gentle redirection. He had tried. She had said no. What do you do? I am not sure I know the answer, but I think it is worth sitting with the fact that he saw the warning signs and could not find a way to act on them. That is its own kind of tragedy layered inside the main one. This is the part I need you to pay close attention to, because it is the most technically important part of the story, and also the part where everything becomes irreversible. When you climb a technical route and tie yourself to the rope, you use a specific knot called a rethreaded figure-8 follow-through. It is also called a figure-8 on a bite, or sometimes just a rewoven figure-8. The name is descriptive. You tie a figure-8 shape in the rope, then thread the tail back through the original knot, retracing its path until the finished product looks like a symmetric, doubled figure-8 pressed flat. It is the standard tie-in knot used by the vast majority of rock climbers worldwide. It is simple, strong, reliable, and almost impossible to get wrong if you do it slowly and pay attention. Almost. Renata began tying in, and while she was doing it, she was talking. She was still processing the ranger confrontation, still working through the argument, still rehearsing lines. She threaded the rope through her harness tie-in points and started forming the figure-8. Then her attention drifted back to the morning's events. She paused, mid-process, to say something to Doven. Then she came back to the knot and continued, or rather, she thought she continued. What she actually did was pick up from a point in the process that was not where she had left off. She believed she had finished rethreading the knot. She had not. The tail of the rope had not been fully traced back through the original figure-8. The resulting knot was not obviously wrong. It was a partially completed figure-8 follow-through, and at a casual glance, especially partially obscured by the harness and the extra rope, it looked close enough to correct that she did not catch it. Because she believed she had already finished the knot, it did not occur to her to look carefully. She did not check it a second time. And then there was the buddy check, which is exactly what it sounds like. You check each other. Harness buckles doubled back, belay device rigged correctly, tie-in knot completed, and dressed properly. You look at your partner's setup and they look at yours, and you confirm out loud that everything is in order. It is one of the most fundamental safety practices in climbing. It exists precisely because of moments like this one, moments where distraction or assumption might cause someone to miss their own error. The buddy check is the backstop. Neither of them did it. Doven did not check Renata's knot. Renata did not ask him to. Whether this was because the whole morning had been too chaotic, or because she was too proud to invite scrutiny after the argument about competence, or simply because the normal rhythm of preparation had been disrupted by everything that came before, I do not know. Probably some combination. But the rope was tied, or seemed to be tied, and they started climbing. The first few pitches went fine. This is the most uncomfortable part of the story for me, honestly, because it means there was a long window during which they could have caught the mistake and did not. Each successful pitch reinforced the belief that everything was working correctly. Renata climbed confidently. The knot was not subjected to the kind of sudden, heavy loading that would have immediately exposed the problem. The early pitches did not require her to take any significant falls. She moved well, placed protection, called out to Doven, hauled gear. Everything looked normal. As they moved higher, the wall changed character. The terrain became more serious. Retreat stopped being a realistic option. Several pitches up, not impossible, but complicated enough that most parties at that point committed to continuing upward. And here is the uncomfortable reality of how commitment works on a big wall. There is a point where going down costs roughly the same effort as going up, and then a point where going down costs more. Once you cross that second threshold, you are psychologically and practically all in. Every foot of elevation you gain deepens that commitment. Renata and Doven had passed that threshold without either of them saying so out loud. They were hundreds of feet above the ground by this point. Fully invested, the valley floor spread out far below them in that vertiginous way that either thrills you or terrifies you depending on your relationship with height.
I have never been that high on a wall, and I genuinely can't imagine what the world actually looks like from up there. But I know that at that altitude, the margin for error is essentially zero.
The unfinished knot had been there the whole time, waiting. They reached a section that was harder than what they had been climbing, a stretch where the rock offered fewer obvious holds, where the moves required more precision, where a moment of imbalance was easier to come by. Renata was working through it. At some point, she shifted her weight in a way that took her off balance, and she fell. Under normal circumstances, this would be an ordinary event. Climbers fall, the rope catches them, they collect themselves, rest for a moment, and try again. The entire system, the knot, the harness, the protection on the wall, the belay device in Doven's hands, is designed for exactly this scenario. But the knot was not a knot. It was a shape that resembled a knot. When Renata's weight came onto the rope suddenly and with force, the incomplete figure eight deformed. Under load, a partially retraced figure eight does not hold the way a completed one does. The tail pulled through. The rope disconnected from her harness. She fell from the wall. Climbers on adjacent routes heard it before they saw it, shouting not the normal communication shouts between climbing partners, but something sharper, more alarmed. They looked toward the route. Several of them were on the phone with emergency services before they could fully process what they had seen. Doven, above on the belay, was unable to comprehend immediately what had happened. The rope had gone slack in a way that made no sense. For a moment, he simply did not understand. Search and rescue personnel responded as quickly as the terrain allowed. The area around the accident site was temporarily closed. Investigators arrived and began the methodical work of reconstructing what had happened. The physical evidence was clear. The rope was intact. The harness showed no signs of failure. The protection on the wall held. When they examined the tie-in, they found what they had feared. A figure eight follow-through that had never been completed. The tail had not been fully traced back through the original knot. It was a preparation error, not an equipment failure. Nothing had broken. The gear had done nothing wrong.
I've thought a lot about what this story means, and I keep coming back to the same uncomfortable place.
The incomplete knot was the technical cause of the accident, but it didn't happen in isolation. It was tied by someone whose attention had been consumed by anger, who dismissed advice and treated every warning as an attack.